Imagine a world without words. No greetings, no names, no stories told around the fire, no way to whisper "I love you," and no way to shout "Look out!" A world where thoughts remain locked inside, escaping only as grunts, cries, or gestures. That silent world was the birthplace of us all. Long before we invented alphabets, long before poetry, politics, or prayer, our ancestors faced the most fundamental problem of all: how to make one mind meet another. 7 million years ago, deep in the African forests and savannas, the earliest hominins began their long journey toward language. These were not yet humans. They were small, ape-like beings, moving between trees and open grasslands. They lived in groups, hunted small animals, gathered fruits, and relied on each other for protection. Their survival depended not only on strong arms or quick legs, but on the ability to cooperate, and cooperation required communication. But what did communication look like before words? To imagine it, we need to look at our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. Even today they cannot speak, but they can communicate in surprisingly complex ways. A chimpanzee can produce dozens of calls, pant hoots, screams, grunts, each carrying a different meaning. A low grunt can signal food, a sharp bark can signal danger, a pant hoot can summon allies. Combined with gestures, an extended arm for begging, a slap for aggression, a beckoning motion for play, their system of communication is rich, flexible, and meaningful. It is likely that our earliest ancestors used a similar mix of sounds and gestures. A mother might scream when a leopard approached, a male might pound his chest to show dominance, a young one might whimper to request comfort. Over time, these signals became more nuanced, more precise, but they were still far from language as we know it. The great challenge of this period was brain size. Around 7 million years ago, our ancestors had brains no larger than a chimpanzee's, about 350-400 cubic centimetres. That is barely a third of the size of modern human brains. With such limited capacity, they could not juggle complex grammar or abstract words. Their communication was immediate and emotional. Food here, danger there, don't touch me, comfort me. It was useful, but it was not yet storytelling. And yet, even simple communication shaped social life. Grooming, for example, was one of the earliest languages of apes and hominins. Picking lice and ticks off each other was not just hygiene, it was a message. I trust you. You're my friend. We are bonded. But as groups grew larger, grooming became impractical. You cannot groom 50 individuals a day. Instead, vocal calls began to take its place. Sound became a shortcut for trust. A friendly call could maintain a bond even at a distance. This shift, from touch to voice, was the first step toward true language. Fast forward to around 4 million years ago. Australopithecus, the famous ape-like hominins who walked upright in Africa, roamed the grasslands. They left behind fossilized footprints, stone tools, and skeletons like the famous Lucy. Their anatomy suggests a voice box not yet capable of producing the wide range of sounds we can. Their throats were high, their mouths small, their tongues less flexible. But they may have already used a few proto-words, distinct sounds with consistent meanings. Perhaps a sharp caw for predator, a soft for food, a rising tone for a question. The most important feature was not the sounds themselves, but the social brain behind them. Living in groups of 20 or 30, Australopithecines needed ways to coordinate. Hunting small animals, warning of snakes, competing for mates. All of it required communication beyond mere screaming. Each generation probably invented new signals, passed them on, and refined them. Bit by bit, the foundation for speech was laid. By 2.5 million years ago, a new species emerged. Homo habilis, the handyman, so named because of their stone tools. With bigger brains, around 600 cubic centimetres, they were capable of more sophisticated cooperation. Making a stone tool is not obvious. It requires teaching, demonstration, imitation. Language, or at least a proto-language, would have been an enormous advantage here. A gesture might show where to strike the rock. A vocal sound might accompany the process. Tack-tack for hitting. Sharp for a cutting edge. Slowly, communication expanded from warning calls to teaching calls. Here we begin to see the outlines of human language, not just reacting to the present, but describing, teaching, and sharing knowledge. A child could learn to make a tool by watching and listening. A hunter could share the location of prey. A group could plan an ambush. The ability to exchange information gave Homo habilis a survival edge. Those who communicated better survived better. Yet there was a limit. Their throats still lacked the full flexibility for modern speech. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors the tongue, was not yet like ours. Their tongues could not make the rich range of vowels and consonants we use today. Still, the seeds were planted. By 2 million years ago, Homo erectus strode onto the scene. Tall, strong, and with brains approaching 900 cubic centimetres, they were the first truly adventurous humans. They left Africa, colonised Asia and Europe, controlled fire, and hunted big game. To do all this required coordination on a new scale. Fire had to be maintained, hunts had to be planned, camps had to be defended, gestures and grunts alone may not have been enough. Many scientists believe Homo erectus had a more advanced vocal system, capable of dozens or even hundreds of distinct sounds. Fire itself was a revolution for communication. Imagine a group of Homo erectus gathered around the flames at night. In the flickering light, they could share experiences, gesture, mimic animals, experiment with sounds. Fire extended the day, creating long evenings for social bonding. It may have been around the fire that language truly began to stretch beyond survival into story. We cannot know their words, but we can imagine their rhythm. A hunter acts out a chase, adding sounds for running, for spears, for the animal's cry. Others laugh, join in, repeat the sounds. Over time, repetition turns into tradition. Tradition turns into vocabulary. The road from grunt to grammar was long, but by the time of Homo erectus, the path was clear. Their expanding brains, their need for cooperation, and their growing mastery of tools and fire all pushed them toward a language. Evolution favoured those who could communicate better. Slowly, generation by generation, the voice became as important as the hand. This was the dawn before language, the great silence slowly breaking. For 5 million years, our ancestors groped toward words. They were not yet poets or prophets, but they had taken the first steps, and those steps would change everything. 2 million years ago, the silence of the African savannah was broken by a new kind of voice. It did not yet weave poetry or philosophy, but it carried more than mere grunts and cries. It belonged to Homo erectus, the first of our ancestors to stride fully upright, to shape fire, to hunt together, and to explore beyond the cradle of Africa. With them begins the story of language as something recognisably human. Homo erectus was unlike anything the world had seen before. Standing nearly as tall as us, with long legs built for endurance, they spread from Africa into Asia and Europe. They built camps, hunted elephants, and may have sailed short stretches of open water. None of this could have been done alone. Cooperation was their greatest tool, and cooperation demanded communication. Their brains, nearly twice the size of Australopithecus, approached 900 cubic centimetres, about 2/3 of modern humans. This expansion was not random. It was fueled by the challenges of social living, remembering who owed whom a favour, who could be trusted in a hunt, who might betray during conflict. Scientists call this the social brain hypothesis, the idea that intelligence evolved not only for survival against nature, but for survival against each other. In such a world, words became weapons and bonds alike. But could Homo erectus truly speak? The evidence is debated. Some argue their vocal tracts were too primitive, limiting the range of sounds. Others point to the discovery of the hyoid bone, a delicate bone in the throat that anchors the tongue and larynx. In modern humans, it allows precise control over speech. A fragment of a hyoid found from later hominins suggests that by at least 500,000 years ago, some ancestors had near-modern vocal anatomy. Even if their voices lacked our full range, their communication system was surely richer than simple grunts. Picture a hunting band preparing to ambush a herd of antelope. Gestures alone would be clumsy in tall grass. Instead, sharp vocal calls, distinct and repeatable, could coordinate movement. One sound for left, another for ready, another for throw. These proto-words, still simple, had power because they were shared. For the first time, sound had begun to detach from the immediate emotion and take on conventional meaning. Fire deepened this transformation. To keep flames alive, Homo erectus had to guard and tend them, passing knowledge of fire-making across generations. Fire also gave them long evenings together. Around a hearth, sounds could become rituals. One individual might mimic the cry of a hunted animal. Another might add gestures. A third might repeat the same sound the next night, until the sound became tradition, a proto-word for that animal. Slowly, memory and repetition carved grooves of meaning. This was the beginning of symbolic reference, the ability of a sound to stand for something not present. A grunt could mean lion, even if no lion was in sight. A call could mean water, even if the river was miles away. This leap was monumental. It freed communication from the here and now. For the first time, minds could share invisible worlds, plans, dangers, possibilities. By 1 million years ago, Homo erectus had spread across continents. Along the way, their descendants evolved into diverse species, Homo heidelbergensis in Africa and Europe, the likely common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. With even larger brains, around 200 cubic centimetres, Homo heidelbergensis hunted in organised groups, built shelters and cared for their dead. To do all this required communication far beyond instinctive calls. They may not have had Shakespeare's tongue, but they had a system rich enough to coordinate hunts, teach tool-making and share emotions. A child who watched elders nap a hand axe needed more than sight. She needed guidance. Perhaps a vocal call, sharp, loud, meant strike harder. A softer sound meant not there. Over time, such calls became standardized within the group, forming the first structured proto-languages. By 600,000 years ago, Neanderthals emerged in Europe and Western Asia. Stocky, strong and resourceful, they thrived in Ice Age conditions. They made sophisticated stone tools, wore clothing and controlled fire with skill. Most tellingly, their anatomy included a modern-like hyoid bone and a vocal tract similar to ours. This suggests that Neanderthals had the capacity for speech nearly as advanced as modern humans. What did Neanderthal speech sound like? Some reconstructions suggest deep, nasal voices, perhaps less melodic than ours, but capable of vowels and consonants. If so, they could have named things, given commands, perhaps even told stories. Archaeological evidence hints at symbolic thinking. They buried their dead, wore ornaments, and mixed pigments. These acts suggest a mind able to think in symbols, and thus a tongue able to speak them. Parallel to Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago. Their brains, averaging 1,350 cubic centimetres, matched ours. Their throats and tongues were fully adapted for speech. Their genes included the FOXP2 gene, crucial for language ability, the same as ours today. By this point, the machinery of language was complete. What remained was culture, the shared conventions of words, grammar and story. Imagine an early Homo sapiens camp in Africa 200,000 years ago. The day's hunt is over. Children play by the fire. Elders sit in a circle. One begins to mimic the chase, adding sounds, the pounding of feet, the cry of the antelope, the cheer of the hunters. Others join in, laughing, repeating the sounds. Over time, these sounds crystallize into words, one for the animal, one for the weapon, one for the victory. These words are passed to children, who repeat them in their own games. Slowly, vocabulary grows, grammar emerges, and stories are born. The leap from call to story was not sudden. It was built over hundreds of thousands of years, each generation refining, combining, and passing on its speech. But by 200,000 years ago, humanity had crossed the threshold. We could not only warn of danger or request food, we could speak of the past, imagine the future, and weave identities from words. The world had entered the age of a language, and with it, a new kind of creature walked the earth, not just an animal of flesh and bone, but an animal of words. 200,000 years ago, in the heart of Africa, a new kind of human walked the earth. They were not taller or stronger than their cousins, but inside their skulls, something extraordinary had taken shape. Their brains were fully modern, their throats and tongues were tuned for speech. Their genes carried the capacity for language as we know it today. These were Homo sapiens, and with them, language finally crossed the threshold from potential to reality. The biological gift. Everything about Homo sapiens' anatomy whispered speech. Their vocal tract was unique, a lowered larynx, a flexible tongue, and finely tuned control of breathing. This arrangement was risky. It made us prone to choking, but it gave us an unmatched range of sounds. We could produce vowels and consonants with subtle variations, combine them endlessly, and shape them into words. Their brains told the other half of the story. Within 350 cubic centimetres of tightly folded neural tissue, they housed specialised regions: Broca's area for speech production, Wernicke's area for comprehension. These areas, interconnected by highways of white matter, turned sounds into meaning and meaning back into sound. No other animal, not even Neanderthals with similar brain sizes, seems to have had the same fine-tuned wiring. Finally, the FOXP2 gene, inherited from earlier ancestors, had stabilised in its modern form. It gave humans precise motor control over lips, tongue and throat. Together, these traits made speech effortless, natural, inevitable. For Homo sapiens, language was no longer a possibility. It was a destiny. First words. But what were the first words? We can never know their exact sounds, but we can guess their kinds. Words for the immediate and the vital. Food, water, fire, mother, danger. Words for kinship, sister, brother, child, because family was the fabric of survival. Words for direction, up, down, near, far, because hunting and foraging demanded coordination. These words were likely short, sharp and rhythmic, easy to shout across a plain or murmur by the fire. Over time, words combined. A call for lion could be joined with a sound for river to mean lion by the river. Simple combinations created proto-sentences. Syntax, the skeleton of grammar, was born. The language of symbols around 100,000 years ago, something remarkable appears in the archaeological record: symbols. In South Africa's Blombos cave, pieces of ochre bear engraved crosshatch patterns. Shell beads, drilled and strung, were worn as ornaments. These were not tools of survival, but tools of meaning. A symbol is useless without agreement. For a bead to represent status or identity, a group must agree on its meaning. And to agree, they must communicate. This is where language truly reveals its power, not just to point at the world, but to invent new worlds of shared imagination. A shell can stand for beauty. A mark can stand for a clan. A story can stand for a law. With symbols, humans began to weave the invisible fabric of culture. Picture a night on the African savannah 80,000 years ago. A group of Homo sapiens gathers around the fire. The flames dance, the stars blaze above. An elder begins to speak. His words, simple but charged, recount a hunt from days before. The stalk, the chase, the danger, the victory. Children lean in, eyes wide. The elder mimics the roar of a lion, the swish of spears, the cheer of triumph. This is no longer just communication. It is storytelling, and storytelling is survival. A child who hears of the lion learns to fear it without facing its teeth. A hunter who hears of distant water remembers the path to find it. A group that shares stories shares knowledge, identity, and purpose. Through stories, Homo sapiens extended memory beyond the individual. Language became a time machine, carrying lessons across generations. The Great Leap Forward. Anthropologists speak of a great leap forward around 70,000 years ago. In this period, symbolic art, advanced tools and long-distance trade explode in the record. Caves in Europe bear paintings of horses, bison and handprints. Figurines carved from ivory depict animals and gods. Humans began to bury their dead with beads, tools and flowers. What changed? The leading theory is language. Once language became complex enough, capable of abstract thought, metaphor and narrative, human culture ignited. Myths explained the world. Rituals unified groups. Plans for tomorrow could be shared in detail. Cooperation reached scales never seen before. Language gave Homo sapiens an edge over every rival species. Neanderthals may have spoken, but their symbolic culture remained limited. Homo erectus endured for millions of years, but their tools barely changed. Homo sapiens, armed with language, innovated constantly. We adapted to deserts, forests, and ice. We coordinated hunts of massive mammoths. We spread across the globe. The birth of us language did more than describe the world. It defined who belonged in it. With words, humans could draw boundaries. Us and them, kin and stranger, friend and foe. Shared language became the badge of belonging. Dialects split groups apart. Shared speech bound them together. In this way, language became not just communication, but identity. A child born into one group learned its words, its stories, its laws. Through speech, she inherited not only genes, but culture. Each word carried history, tradition, and power. Myths and meaning. With language, imagination soared. Humans began to create myths, stories that explained the unexplainable. Thunder was not just noise, it was a god's voice. The sun was not just light, it was a spirit crossing the sky. Death was not the end, but a journey. These myths were not childish illusions. They were powerful tools. A myth binds a group with shared belief, motivates bravery in battle, and provides comfort in grief. Myths turn scattered individuals into communities, and communities change the world. Towards civilization. By 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens spoke languages as rich and complex as any today. They had thousands of words, rules of grammar, tenses for past and future, metaphors and poetry. They carried their languages as they spread across the globe into Europe, Asia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. 50,000 years ago, the world was alive with new voices. From the caves of Europe to the coasts of Asia, from the savannas of Africa to the forests of Australia, Homo sapiens spread across the globe, carrying with them the greatest tool ever forged, language. This was no longer the age of proto-words and fragmented calls. Humans now spoke in full languages, rich, flexible, and endlessly inventive. With thousands of words, rules of grammar, and the ability to talk of past, present, and future, our ancestors could imagine and share entire worlds, and in doing so they created something even larger than themselves: culture. Voices around the fire. Imagine a camp in Ice Age Europe. The night is cold, the fire crackles, and shadows flicker on the walls of a cave. Children huddle close as an elder begins to speak. His voice rises and falls with rhythm. He tells of the hunt, of ancestors long gone, of spirits in the sky. The children gasp, laugh, shiver. They are not just hearing sounds. They are entering a shared dream. This was the essence of oral tradition. Stories became the memory of the group, the way knowledge survived across generations. In an oral culture, language was not just a tool for communication. It was a library, a school, a temple. Every firelit tale carried warnings, lessons, and hopes. A story about a lion taught children to be cautious. A myth about the stars taught travellers to navigate. A song about ancestors bound the living to the dead. Language turned memory into collective memory, and collective memory into identity. Myths of origin. Across the world, groups began to create myths, stories of where they came from and why they mattered. In every corner of the earth, we see echoes of these early tales. A hunter-gatherer band in Africa might speak of a great animal spirit who created the world. A group in Europe might tell of ancestors who emerged from a cave. In Australia, Dreamtime stories described how the land itself was sung into being. Though the details differed, the purpose was the same. Myths gave meaning. They explained the unexplainable, justified the rules of society, and offered comfort in the face of death. They turned random existence into narrative. Without myths, humans would have been clever animals. With myths, they became cultural beings. Songs, rhythm, and memory language alone was not enough. Rhythm and song became vital tools for memory. Before writing, knowledge had to be remembered. And nothing is remembered more easily than music. Early humans discovered that if you set words to rhythm, they stick. A chant could preserve the steps of a ritual. A song could record the path to water or the rules of a hunt. Poetic devices, rhyme, repetition, rhythm, were not invented for art alone. They were technologies of memory. Even today we remember the alphabet through song, we chant in ceremonies, we recite prayers in rhythm. These traditions echo the ancient discovery that to sing is to preserve. Language and migration. As humans spread, language diversified. Groups who separated by rivers, mountains, or migrations began to speak differently. Over generations, accents became dialects, and dialects became distinct languages. By 30,000 years ago, the world was already full of linguistic diversity. In Europe, the ancestors of Indo-European tongues were stirring. In Africa, the deep roots of Niger, Congo, and Khoisan languages grew. In Asia, the early ancestors of Sino-Tibetan and Dravidian languages took shape. Each language was a map of a people's journey, carrying traces of where they had been and what they had valued. A word for snow might be rich and varied in the north, while a word for desert winds might dominate in the south. Language was not just a tool, it was a mirror of environment, culture, and migration. Language as law. In these early societies, language also became law. Without written codes, rules had to be spoken, remembered, and repeated. Elders recited taboos: what foods to eat, what paths to avoid, whom to marry. These spoken rules were binding. To break them was to risk not only punishment, but exile. Words gained the power to govern. A spoken curse could inspire fear. A blessing could give courage. A promise, once spoken, became a contract. Language created invisible bonds stronger than stone. Ritual and religion. Ritual emerged from the power of repetition. Words spoken in rhythm became chants, chants became prayers, prayers became religion. Early shamans and leaders discovered that certain words, spoken with authority, could change how people felt and behaved. A chant before the hunt gave courage. A prayer after death gave comfort. Religion, at its core, is language woven into ceremony. Without words, belief is private. With words, belief becomes collective. Shared prayers bound communities as tightly as shared blood. Cave paintings and the expansion of language. In caves across Europe, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, paintings of bison, horses, and human handprints blaze across the walls. These were not idle doodles. They were part of a symbolic system. The images may have been paired with stories, chants, and rituals. Together, they formed multimedia experiences: oral, visual, communal. Language and art were not separate. They reinforced each other, weaving culture into a powerful net of meaning. The power of gossip. As groups grew larger, another function of language became central: gossip. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar proposed the grooming hypothesis, that language replaced physical grooming as a way of bonding large groups. In small groups, grooming each other's fur created trust. But as human groups expanded to dozens or even hundreds, physical grooming was impossible. Language filled the gap. Through gossip, sharing news, judging behavior, retelling events, humans could maintain social cohesion in groups larger than any primate could manage. Gossip was not trivial. It was survival. It told people who could be trusted, who had broken the rules, who was strong, who was weak. In this way, language became the glue of society. Toward agriculture. By the end of this period, around 10,000 years ago, humans stood on the brink of an even greater change. Agriculture. Villages were forming, herds were being domesticated, crops were being planted. And with this shift, language would once again transform. No longer would it serve only as the keeper of the myths and oral tradition. It would soon become the tool of record, bureaucracy, and civilization itself. But before writing, before cities, before kings and empires, language had already done its greatest work. It had turned scattered bands of hunters into cultural communities. It had created memory, myth, ritual, and law. It had made us not just humans, but storytelling humans. Between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, language created culture. Around fires, in caves, across continents, words became the vessels of myth and memory. They carried identity, bound communities, and shaped the invisible architectures of law and belief. The world was no longer just inhabited by humans. It was inhabited by stories. and soon those stories would take on physical form. Humans were about to invent something even more powerful than speech: writing. The turning point. Around 10,000 years ago, the world began to change. The Ice Age was ending. Glaciers melted, forests spread, rivers swelled, and fertile land opened across the globe. Humans, who for hundreds of thousands of years had lived as hunters and gatherers, began to experiment with something new: farming. Farming brought food security. Food security brought larger groups. Larger groups brought villages, towns, and eventually cities. But with these new societies came a problem. Memory was no longer enough. For a small band of hunter-gatherers, spoken tradition worked well. Elders told stories, passed down laws, and remembered who owed what. But in a village of hundreds, or a city of thousands, spoken language struggled. Who planted which field? Who stored how much grain? Who traded with whom? Who paid tribute to the temple? For the first time in human history, language needed help. It needed to step beyond sound and become visible. And so, writing was born. The first marks. Before writing as we know it, there were proto-scripts, systems of symbols used to track goods, ownership, or rituals. Archaeologists have found evidence as far back as 9,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. Small clay tokens, each shaped differently to represent goats, jars of oil, or measures of grain. Farmers and merchants used them to record transactions. Over time, they realized that instead of carrying a sack of tokens, they could press them into a clay tablet. Suddenly, symbols on clay stood for real things. This was the seed of writing. It wasn't born to write poetry or philosophy. It was born to count sheep and store grain. Sumer, the birthplace of writing. Around 5,000 years ago, in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, these clay marks evolved into the first full writing system, cuneiform. Scribes used a reed stylus to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. At first, each symbol represented a concrete thing: an ox, a jar, a measure. But soon, the system grew more abstract. A symbol could represent not just an object, but also a sound or an idea. This leap allowed people to write names, contracts, and even stories. The world's first recorded literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written in cuneiform, telling of gods, kings, and the search for immortality. With cuneiform, language became immortal. Spoken words vanished as soon as they were uttered. Written words could last millennia. In fact, some of those clay tablets survive today, still carrying the voices of people who lived 4,000 years ago. Egypt. Writing as sacred art, not long after Mesopotamia, another great river civilization invented its own system: Egyptian hieroglyphs. Where cuneiform was practical, hieroglyphs were beautiful. Carved into temple walls or painted in tombs, they combined pictures and symbols into a dazzling script. To Egyptians, writing was not just a tool, it was divine. They believed that hieroglyphs had been given by the god Thoth, the patron of wisdom and writing. Hieroglyphs served two main functions: recording the practical business of state, taxes, laws, inventories, and preserving the eternal. Tomb inscriptions prayed for the dead, told of their lives, and ensured their souls would live on. Writing in Egypt was as much about the afterlife as it was about daily life. The Indus script. Further east, in the Indus Valley, people developed a mysterious system of writing around 4,000 years ago. Inscribed on seals, pottery, and amulets, the Indus script is made of small abstract symbols, but unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphs, the Indus script has never been deciphered. We don't know what it says. We don't know if it recorded trade, prayers, or myths. Its silence is haunting, an entire civilization speaking to us across time, but in a language we cannot understand. China, words on bone and bronze. Meanwhile, in ancient China, writing emerged in a different form. By 3,000 years ago, Chinese diviners were carving questions into oracle bones, animal shoulder blades and turtle shells. They asked the ancestors about harvests, wars, and weather, then heated the bones until they cracked. The cracks were read as answers, and the carved inscriptions recorded the questions. From these religious practices grew the world's longest continuous writing system: Chinese characters. Unlike alphabets, Chinese script was logographic. Each character represented a word or idea. This gave the script immense stability. While languages around it shifted and died, Chinese writing endured. Even today, many characters used in modern Mandarin trace their roots directly back to those carved bones. Writing as power. Writing was more than a clever invention. It was power. In early states, only scribes, priests, or rulers could read and write. Writing allowed them to control information, to record debts, to codify laws, to track harvests, to glorify kings. A spoken promise could be denied, but a written contract endured. Writing also allowed rulers to extend their voices beyond their presence. A decree written on stone could govern thousands who never saw the king's face. Writing turned authority into something permanent and far-reaching. In this sense, writing created bureaucracy, and bureaucracy created civilization. Oral versus written worlds. But it's important to remember, for most people life remained oral. Even as writing spread, 99% of humans could not read or write. Stories, laws, and myths still lived in the spoken word. Writing was a supplement, not a replacement. In fact, oral and written cultures often clashed. Writing froze words, but oral tradition was fluid, changing with each retelling. A written law was rigid, an oral law could bend. A written myth became fixed, an oral myth could adapt to new times. This tension between the permanence of writing and the flexibility of speech would shape human history for millennia. From clay to papyrus, over time, humans found new materials to write on. In Egypt, they discovered papyrus, thin sheets made from the papyrus plant, easier to carry than heavy clay tablets. In Mesopotamia, they began to use parchment made from animal skins. These lighter, portable writing surfaces allowed records, letters, and stories to travel farther and faster. Writing was no longer chained to temples and palaces. It was beginning to move out into the world. The dawn of literature. With writing came literature. Myths and epics that had once lived only in memory could now be recorded. The Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, the pyramid texts in Egypt, the oracle bone inscriptions in China, these were not just records. They were works of imagination and culture, preserved for eternity. For the first time, humans could speak across centuries. A scribe in 2000 BCE could send a message to a reader in 2000 CE. Writing gave humans a voice that time could not silence. Between 10,000 and 3,000 years ago, humanity transformed language forever. From tokens and clay to hieroglyphs and oracle bones, words leapt from the air onto the page. Writing solved the problem of memory, created the machinery of states, and gave birth to literature. But writing was still young, still the preserve of the few. Soon, it would spread farther, shaping empires, religions, and entire civilizations. In the next stage of our story, language would become a weapon, a unifier, and a tool of conquest. The age of empires and linguistic power was about to begin. Language becomes a civilization. By around 3,000 years ago, writing had matured. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphs in Egypt, Chinese characters in East Asia. These systems were no longer experiments. They were sophisticated, flexible, and deeply integrated into the machinery of states. But now something new was happening. Societies were getting bigger, more interconnected, and more ambitious. They were building empires, and empires demanded more than armies and taxes. They demanded a common voice. Language was about to become a weapon of power. The Greeks and the gift of alphabet. In the Mediterranean world, a quiet revolution was taking place. The alphabet. The Phoenicians, great seafaring traders of the Levant, had developed a script around 1000 BCE that was radically simple. Instead of hundreds of characters like cuneiform or hieroglyphs, it used around 24 symbols to represent sounds. The Greeks borrowed and modified this script, adding vowels. For the first time, writing could closely mirror speech. The Greek alphabet was easy to learn, efficient and democratic. Suddenly, literacy was not limited to priests and scribes. Merchants, poets, and philosophers could write too. With this alphabet, Greece blossomed. Philosophy, science, drama, and history flourished in written form. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, once sung by bards, were written down. Plato's dialogues captured the voice of Socrates. Herodotus wrote the first great histories. Greek became more than a language. It became a vehicle for ideas, democracy, philosophy, mathematics. And when Alexander the Great built his empire in the 4th century BCE, Greek spread across the known world. From Egypt to India, it became the lingua franca of scholarship and trade. Latin, the language of empire. If Greek was the language of thought, Latin became the language of power. Rome began as a small city-state with its own dialect of Italic speech. But as its legions conquered the Mediterranean, Latin spread like wildfire. Soldiers, administrators, and settlers carried it into Gaul, Iberia, North Africa, and Britain. Latin was practical, disciplined, and direct, much like Roman governance itself. Laws were codified in Latin, contracts, decrees, and military orders were written in Latin. And with the Roman road system, Latin words travelled farther and faster than ever before. But here's the twist. The Latin of the people was not the polished Latin of Cicero or Caesar. Ordinary soldiers and farmers spoke a rougher, evolving form called Vulgar Latin. Over centuries, this spoken Latin splintered into new tongues: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. The Romance languages were born from the empire's expansion. Even after Rome fell, Latin lived on. For over 1,000 years, it remained the language of law, scholarship, and the church in Europe. Rome died, but its words did not. Sanskrit, the sacred tongue of India. While Greek and Latin shaped the West, Sanskrit shaped South Asia. Sanskrit was not just a language. It was considered the divine sound of the universe. The Vedas, ancient hymns of Hinduism, were composed and memorized in Sanskrit long before they were written down. Priests recited them with extraordinary precision, believing that the power of the rituals depended on the exact sound of each syllable. When Sanskrit began to be written, it became the medium for epic literature like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. Vast stories of gods, heroes, and cosmic struggle. It was also the language of philosophy, mathematics, and science in ancient India. Sanskrit travelled beyond India's borders too, carried by Buddhism. From Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia, Sanskrit words and texts left their mark, blending into local languages and scripts. Chinese, the bureaucrat's language. In China, writing remained central to governance. The Chinese script, complex and logographic, became the glue of a vast empire. During the Qin dynasty, 3rd century BCE, Emperor Qin Shi Huang unified China and imposed a standardized system of writing. Even if people in different regions spoke mutually unintelligible dialects, they could all read the same script. Writing unified what speech divided. The civil service examinations that emerged later cemented this role. To govern, one had to master the Confucian classics, all written in classical Chinese. For centuries, literacy and bureaucracy were inseparable. Chinese characters also spread to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, shaping their written traditions. Even when those societies developed their own scripts, the influence of Chinese writing remained profound. Language and religion language was not just about trade and governance. It became the vessel of faith. In the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew was more than words. It was God's speech to humanity. In India, Sanskrit hymns were thought to be eternal sounds, heard by sages in visions. In Zoroastrian Persia, Avestan carried the words of the prophet Zarathustra. Later in the Roman Empire, Greek and Latin would carry Christianity. Aramaic, once a regional Semitic language, spread so widely that by the time of Jesus, it was the everyday speech of much of the Middle East. Even as empires fell, Aramaic lingered. In fact, small communities still speak dialects of it today. This pattern repeated again and again, empires rising, choosing a lingua franca, spreading it, and leaving linguistic legacies that outlived their political power. The fall of empires, the survival. A world after Rome, the year is 500 CE. Rome, once the master of the Mediterranean, is in ruins. Germanic tribes rule much of Europe. Roads decay, cities shrink, and centralized government collapses. But amid the ruins, Latin still lingers. Yet Latin is not what it once was. In the marketplaces of Gaul, Iberia, and Italy, the Latin of the people, Vulgar Latin, has splintered into different sounds and patterns. Soldiers, peasants, and traders had long spoken a looser form than the refined prose of Cicero. Now, without a unifying empire, those spoken dialects diverged even faster. By around 800 CE, the seeds of new languages were firmly rooted: French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian. They were still recognisably Latin, but with local flavours. The Romance languages had been born. The fall of Rome showed something remarkable. While empires die, words survive by evolving. Old English and the birth of Germanic tongues. Meanwhile, in northern Europe, the Germanic tribes were reshaping the linguistic map. The Angles, Saxons and Jutes crossed the sea into Britain and brought with them their West Germanic dialects. Out of this stew emerged Old English. If you read Beowulf in its original tongue, you'd hardly recognise it as English. Huet, Wigardina in Giardagum, Theochininga, Thrimgefrunon. This is English in its infancy, guttural, rhythmic and filled with Germanic roots. Over centuries, Old English absorbed words from Norse, thanks to Viking invasions, and later from French, after the Norman conquest in 1066. That fusion gave us the vast, flexible English vocabulary we know today. Other Germanic languages were also finding their shape. Old High German, ancestor of modern German. Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, which would split into Danish, Swedish, Norwegian and Icelandic. Dutch and its cousin Flemish, thriving in the Low Countries. By the end of the medieval period, Europe was a patchwork of distinct languages, many still recognisable today. Arabic, the language of revelation and science. In the 7th century, a new force reshaped the linguistic world: Islam. When the Prophet Muhammad received the Quran, it was in classical Arabic. To Muslims, the Quran was not just a holy book, it was the literal word of God, inimitable and eternal. This elevated Arabic to a sacred status, uniting diverse peoples across the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. But Arabic was not only a religious language, it became the medium of a scientific and intellectual golden age. Between the 8th and 13th centuries, scholars in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo wrote in Arabic about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and poetry. Arabic became what Greek had once been, the lingua franca of knowledge. Words like algebra, alchemy, zenith, and sugar entered other languages, a testament to Arabic's global influence. Sanskrit, Pali, and the languages of India. In South Asia, Sanskrit remained the language of high culture and religion. Hindu epics, philosophical treatises, and scientific texts continued to be written in it. But in daily life, ordinary people spoke evolving Prakrits, the natural changing dialects. One of these, Pali, became central to Buddhism, carrying the teachings of the Buddha across Asia. In Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, Pali texts shaped entire cultures. By the late medieval period, new vernaculars were rising in India, early forms of Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and others. These languages blended Sanskrit vocabulary with local speech, setting the stage for the modern Indian linguistic landscape. Chinese, stability. Amid change. In China, language followed a different path. Dynasties rose and fell, but the Chinese writing system endured. While spoken dialects varied enormously, Mandarin in the north, Cantonese in the south, Wu around Shanghai, the script united them. A scholar in Beijing could read the words of a poet in Guangzhou even if they couldn't understand each other's speech. This gave Chinese a unique continuity. The poems of the Tang dynasty, 7th-10th centuries, can still be read today with only moderate difficulty, though spoken Chinese has changed. The written word became a bridge across time. Chinese also influenced its neighbours. Japan borrowed Chinese characters, kanji, adapting them into their own writing system. Korea did the same before later inventing Hangul in the 15th century. Vietnam used Chinese characters until the Latin-based Kwok-Jiu script replaced them centuries later. The role of religion in shaping languages. Religion was perhaps the single most powerful force in language during the medieval period. Latin remained the language of the Christian Church in Europe. Priests read the Bible in Latin, sermons were delivered in Latin, and scholars wrote in Latin. For centuries, ordinary Europeans did not hear scripture in their own tongue. Greek survived as the liturgical and scholarly language of the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Arabic was the sacred language of Islam and the intellectual bridge across Africa, the Middle East and Spain. Hebrew, largely dormant as a spoken language, lived on in Jewish religious practice, preserved in prayer, commentary and scripture. Sacred languages often resisted change, freezing in time while spoken languages evolved around them. This created a gap. A farmer in France might speak Old French at home but hear only Latin in church. That divide would have enormous consequences later. The first vernacular revolutions. By the High Middle Ages, around 1100 CE, something new was stirring. People began writing great works not just in Latin or Greek, but in vernacular languages, the everyday speech of ordinary people. In Italy, Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy in Tuscan Italian around 1300, helping elevate it into the national language of Italy centuries later. In England, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, earthy, humorous, and alive with the voices of real people. In France, troubadours and poets sang in Old French and Occitan. In Spain, El Cid was sung in Castilian. In Germany, poets like Walter von der Vogelweide wrote in Middle High German. For the first time since Rome, the languages of the people were being written and celebrated as worthy of literature. This democratized language and gave national identities their first real voices. The printing press, a linguistic earthquake. The medieval period closed with a revolution that would change language forever, the printing press. When Johannes Gutenberg perfected movable type in the mid-15th century, books became cheaper and more widely available. Before, manuscripts had to be copied by hand, slow, expensive, and prone to error. Now texts could be reproduced quickly and consistently. This had three massive consequences. 1. Standardization of a language. Printing fixed spellings and grammar. A book printed in London used the London dialect of English, slowly pushing other dialects aside. The same happened in German, French, Spanish, and Italian. Nations began to coalesce around shared written forms. 2. Spread of vernacular literature. Instead of only Latin books, printers began producing works in local tongues. This made knowledge accessible to more people and boosted literacy. 3. Religious upheaval. When Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, early 1500s, it wasn't just a theological act, it was a linguistic revolution. Ordinary people could now read scripture in their own language. This weakened Latin's dominance and fueled the Protestant Reformation. The printing press turned language into a mass phenomenon. Once words belonged to scribes, priests and scholars. Now they could belong to everyone. Between 500 and 1500 CE, languages transformed dramatically. Empires fell, but new tongues rose. Sacred languages preserved ancient traditions, while vernaculars found their voices. And by the time Gutenberg's press began to roll, the world was on the verge of a new linguistic age, one where words would travel farther, faster, and deeper than ever before. A new age of travel, a new age of words. The year is 1500. The medieval world is ending and the age of exploration has begun. Portuguese caravels skim the African coast. Spanish ships cross the Atlantic. English and Dutch vessels chase trade routes across oceans. For the first time, the world is becoming truly connected. And wherever humans go, their languages go with them. What follows is both a story of expansion and conquest, but also of fusion and survival. For every language that spread across the globe, others were pushed aside, silenced, or transformed into new forms. Spanish and Portuguese. The first global languages. No languages were transformed more quickly than Spanish and Portuguese. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he carried Castilian Spanish with him. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors had conquered vast territories in the Americas, Mexico, Peru, the Caribbean, and beyond. Alongside soldiers came priests, who taught Catholic prayers in Spanish, and administrators, who imposed Spanish as the language of governance. By 1600, Spanish was being spoken from California to Chile, and from Havana to Manila in the Philippines. Portuguese followed a different route. From Lisbon, ships sailed around Africa to India, to Southeast Asia, to Brazil, and to Africa again. Portuguese became the language of trade, diplomacy, and empire. In Brazil, it fused with indigenous languages and African tongues brought by enslaved people, creating a distinctive Brazilian Portuguese still alive today. Today, more than 580 million people speak Spanish, and 265 million speak Portuguese, a direct legacy of the 16th century voyages. English. From island tongue to world power. In 1500, English was still a local language, spoken only in England and parts of Scotland. It had just emerged from the medieval period, with Chaucer's Middle English giving way to early modern English, the language of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. But in the following centuries, English expanded beyond anyone's imagination. The first wave came with colonization of North America. Pilgrims, settlers and traders carried English to Virginia, New England and later to Canada. Different conditions shaped different accents, but the base remained. The second wave came with the Caribbean and the Atlantic slave trade. Here, English collided with African languages and gave birth to Creoles, new hybrid languages like Jamaican patois. The third wave was in India, Africa and Oceania, where British colonization planted English as the language of administration, law and education. By 1900, English had become the language of an empire that covered a quarter of the globe. It was still not yet the world's default language that would come in the 20th century, but its global foundation had been laid. French, the language of prestige. If Spanish and English spread through conquest, French spread through culture. In the 17th and 18th centuries, French was the language of diplomacy and aristocracy. Courts from St. Petersburg to Versailles to London used French in treaties, letters, and etiquette. Voltaire, Rousseau, and Enlightenment thinkers wrote in French, making it the intellectual language of Europe. The French Revolution of 1789 later spread ideals and words across the continent. Meanwhile, colonization extended French overseas: Canada, Quebec, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, Indochina. Even after the fall of Napoleon, French maintained prestige as the language of refinement. Dutch, the language of trade. The Dutch Republic, though small, became a trading powerhouse. Dutch merchants carried their language to South Africa, where it evolved into Afrikaans. In Indonesia, Dutch coexisted with Malay and local tongues for centuries. In the Caribbean, Dutch remained in pockets like Curaçao and Suriname. Though never as global as English or Spanish, Dutch left behind strong linguistic footprints. The tragedy of indigenous languages. But while European languages spread, thousands of indigenous languages began to fade. In the Americas, Aztec scribes once wrote in Nahuatl, and Inca messengers carried messages in Quechua. These languages survived colonization to some degree, but countless others were erased when populations were decimated by disease, war, and forced assimilation. In North America, Algonquian, Iroquoian, and Siouan languages were suppressed as English expanded. In South America, languages of the Amazon disappeared as Portuguese and Spanish advanced. In Australia and New Zealand, indigenous languages faced similar decline under English colonization. Language loss was not just about words. Each extinction meant the loss of myths, oral histories, ecological knowledge, and world views, entire universes of meaning. The Atlantic slave trade and Creole languages, one of the most profound linguistic transformations of this period, was the birth of Creole languages. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly taken across the Atlantic. On plantations, people from different ethnic groups, speaking different African languages, were forced to communicate with each other and with European overseers. The result was a blending of languages, European vocabulary, with African grammar and rhythm. These became Creole languages, vibrant, living tongues, like Haitian Creole, based on French plus African languages, Jamaican patois, English plus African, Papiamento in the Caribbean, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch plus African. Creoles are proof that even in oppression, humans create new languages to survive, adapt, and build community. Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. Old powers, new worlds. While Europe expanded overseas, the Islamic world remained a powerful linguistic sphere. Arabic continued as the language of religion and trade, spreading across North and East Africa. Persian flourished in Iran, Central Asia and India, as the language of poetry, philosophy, and Mughal courts. Turkish, under the Ottomans, became the administrative language of an empire stretching from the Balkans to Arabia. Though not as globally dominant as European tongues, these languages shaped entire regions and resisted being overshadowed. Chinese, a giant at home. In China, Mandarin was increasingly standardized during the Ming 1368 to 1644 and Qing 1644-1911 dynasties. With over 100 million speakers even then, Chinese remained the largest linguistic community in the world. Unlike European powers, China did not pursue global colonization, but its language radiated influence through trade and migration, reaching Southeast Asia. Science, enlightenment, and knowledge. Between 1600 and 1800, the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment reshaped Europe. Latin, long the language of scholarship, was gradually replaced by vernaculars. Newton wrote in English, Descartes in French, Leibniz in German. Knowledge was no longer confined to Latin elites. It was available in the languages of the people. This democratization of language helped fuel revolutions in thought, politics, and society. Language and national identity. By the 19th century, nations began defining themselves by language. The rise of nationalism tied identity to a mother tongue. Germany, Italy, and other emerging states emphasized linguistic unity. Movements in Eastern Europe sought to revive suppressed languages like Czech, Hungarian, and Polish. In India, reformers promoted Hindi and Bengali literature. In Ireland, Gaelic revivalists resisted English dominance. Across the world, people began to see language not just as a tool, but as the soul of their nation. The 19th century toward a globalized linguistic future. By 1900, the world's linguistic map had been redrawn. English, Spanish, Portuguese, and French had become global forces. Chinese, Arabic, Hindi, and Russian remained regional giants. Indigenous languages continued to decline, though many held strong in rural and oral traditions. Creoles and mixed languages flourished in the cracks of empire. For the first time in history, it was possible to cross oceans and continents and still hear the same few languages dominating. Yet beneath the surface, the human voice remained endlessly diverse. More than 6,000 languages still existed, each with its own stories, songs, and memories. The stage was set for the modern era of language, one where technology, mass media, and globalization would both connect and threaten the voices of humanity. The Age of Empire made language global. Some tongues spread to every corner of the earth, while others struggled to survive. The story of this period is one of expansion and loss, of conquest and creativity, of dominance and resistance. By 1900, humanity was speaking in ways that connected continents, but also carried the scars of colonization and oppression. The 20th century would bring an even bigger transformation. For the first time, technology would give languages the power to leap across space instantly, carried not by ships, but by radio, film, television, and eventually the internet. The age of global communication was about to begin. A new millennium, a new conversation. The 21st century opened with a revolution not in armies or empires, but in networks of information. By the year 2000, fewer than 500 million people had internet access. By 2025, more than 5 billion humans would be online, over half of humanity. For the first time in history, billions of voices could speak to each other instantly, unbound by geography, often unbound by even literacy. This was not just a new phase in communication, it was the birth of a new linguistic ecosystem, one that reshaped how humans use language, who gets heard, and what it means to speak. The rise of texting and online slang. In the early 2000s, the mobile phone was still primarily a tool for calling, but soon, SMS text messages exploded. Limited to 160 characters, text forced people to compress language. Words were shortened, vowels dropped, and new shorthand systems emerged. LOL, BRB, OMG, and U for you became universal digital slang. At first, critics worried this would ruin language, but linguists quickly realized it was simply evolution in action. Humans were adapting language to fit a new medium. Online forums, chat rooms, and instant messengers like MSN, AIM, and Yahoo Chat expanded this trend. A new informal, rapid-fire written speech emerged, halfway between speaking and writing with its own grammar and rhythm, social media and the global feed. If texting was the seed, social media was the forest. Platforms like Facebook 2004, Twitter 2006, YouTube 2005, and Instagram 2010 created vast digital public squares. Suddenly every person could broadcast thoughts to an audience. Language shifted again. Twitter's 140-character limit sharpened wit into brevity. Facebook posts blurred the line between diary and public statement. YouTube gave rise to video blogs and influencers whose catchphrases spread worldwide. Social media also created memes, a new kind of cultural linguistic unit. Images, jokes, and short phrases circulated rapidly, mutating as they spread. Memes were the folk tales of the digital era, passed not orally but virally. Emojis. The return of picture writing. In 2011, Apple introduced the emoji keyboard on iPhones. Almost overnight, people around the world adopted tiny icons to supplement, and sometimes replace, words. A smiley face, a thumbs up, a red heart, a crying face. These symbols transcended linguistic barriers. A person in Brazil, Japan, or Egypt could understand them without translation. In a way, emojis were a return to the earliest form of writing, pictographs. They were not replacements for language, but supplements, carrying tone and emotion that plain text often lacked. Some linguists call emojis the first global script, a universal set of symbols that people of every language can use in digital communication. Multilingual Internet. At first, the Internet was dominated by English. In 1998, more than 80% of websites were in English. But by the 2020s, this dominance began to fade. Chinese, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, Portuguese, and dozens of other languages surged online. Platforms like WeChat, TikTok, and WhatsApp created multilingual spaces where billions communicated in their own tongues. Translation technology accelerated this shift. Google Translate, launched in 2006, grew to support over 100 languages. By the 2020s, AI-powered translation allowed near-instant speech-to-text and text-to-speech in dozens of languages. For the first time in history, humans could speak across linguistic divides instantly. A Japanese tourist in France could point a phone at a menu and see the translation. A Kenyan farmer could text a question in Swahili and receive an answer in English. The Tower of Babel was not torn down, but bridged. The dark side. Language death. Accelerates. Yet even as technology connected people, linguistic diversity declined. By 2025, linguists warned that half of the world's remaining 7,000 languages could vanish by 2100. The reasons were complex. Younger generations choosing global languages like English, Mandarin, or Spanish for opportunity. Governments prioritizing official national languages over minority tongues. The internet amplifying dominant languages while marginalizing smaller ones. Every time a language dies, a unique worldview disappears. Stories, songs, metaphors, ways of seeing the world vanish forever. The paradox of the digital age is clear. Never before have so many people been able to speak to each other, and never before have so many languages been silenced. Artificial intelligence, machines that speak. Perhaps the most astonishing development of the 21st century is that language itself has begun to detach from humans. Voice assistants like Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant brought conversational AI into daily life. Chatbots could answer questions, schedule reminders, even tell jokes. Then came large language models, AI systems that could generate essays, stories, code, and conversations in natural human language. For the first time, humans were not just teaching machines to process language, machines were producing it. This raised profound questions. If machines can speak, what does that mean for human communication? Will AI standardize language globally, or create new dialects of machine-human speech? Could AI one day preserve endangered languages by speaking them fluently even when no human does? The 21st century may not just be the era of digital tongues, but the era of post-human language. Global youth speech. Another striking change is the rise of global youth slang. From American hip-hop to Korean K-pop, Nigerian Afrobeats to Latin reggaeton, young people around the world mix languages fluidly. English, Spanish, Arabic, Swahili, and slang terms leap across borders through music, memes, and TikTok trends. A teenager in Nairobi and a teenager in Sao Paulo might not share a native language, but they might both say lit, bro, or fam while dancing to the same viral song. This new global dialect is informal, playful, and constantly evolving. The first true world youth language in history. The future of language. Where does language go from here? Several possibilities loom. 1. Global English or global hybrid English may remain the world's lingua franca, but heavily hybridized by local slang, pronunciation, and vocabulary. Globish, a simplified international English, may become the default. 2. Revival of endangered languages. Technology may help small languages survive. Digital archives, language learning apps, and AI tutors could breathe new life into tongues once thought doomed. 3. Universal translation. Instant, seamless AI translation may eventually make learning new languages unnecessary for communication. If everyone can speak their native tongue and be understood, linguistic diversity might thrive. 4. Post-linguistic communication. Some futurists imagine communication moving beyond words, through brain-to-brain interfaces, holograms, or other technologies. In that case, the history of language may give way to the history of thought. Ending, from first words to infinite voices. 7 million years ago, a hominin on an African savanna may have made the first meaningful sound that carried beyond instinct. A warning cry, a call, a proto-word. From that moment, language evolved through grunts and gestures, through cave art and chants, through writing and alphabets, through printing presses and telegraphs, through radio and television, through the internet and smartphones. Today, we stand in a world where billions of voices connect instantly, where machines join the chorus, where ancient tongues risk fading even as new digital dialects are born. Language is not finished. It never will be. It is the living mirror of humanity, growing, changing, splitting, merging, and forever shaping who we are. The history of language is ultimately the history